Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library, and I'm here to continue reading Witch Witch by Eva Ibbotson, published by Scholastic. We're going to pick up with chapter 7. Previously, we've just met a new character whose name is Terrence. He is a small boy who was abandoned when he was a baby and put into a children's home with a very, very mean matron who tried to hurt his little earthworm pet, whose name is Rover. Belladonna found Terrence very upset over Rover's injury and helped heal Rover, and then discovered that with Rover's help, she seems to be able to do black magic, which she's never been able to do before in her life. So Terrence, Rover, and Belladonna have all come back to the contest to see who will be the future wife of Araman the Awful. They've just found out that the hotel does not want them there anymore, and Araman does not want them in the castle, and so they're having to deal with the fact that the witches are going to have to camp. And it is October in England. So we'll start with chapter 7. The news that the witches were to camp hit Mr. Ledbetter extremely hard. Once, before he came to work for Araman, he had taken a camping holiday in the south of France. He could remember a huge ironmonger's daughter from Berlin who had lost her way back to her tent at night and fallen like a felled ox across the ropes of his tent. He could remember an old Greek lady cutting her toenails into the sink, and 3 sunburnt Italian men who had stumped up and down with blaring transistor radios. He remembered the dead toad cut in the slatted floor of the shower block, and the hairy housewife from Luxembourg who had sat on the steps of her caravan shaving her legs. And when he remembered that these were all ordinary people, the thought of what the witches would make of camping made him groan aloud. "Sometimes I don't know what I've just done to deserve it, Lester. I honestly don't," he said to the ogre. But of course he went out, good secretary that he was, and ordered everything he could think of, tents and sleeping bags and folding chairs, and had the stuff sent up to Darkington. Then he borrowed the manager's top hat and wrote the numbers 1 to 7 on bits of paper and put them inside the hat, and left it on the piano stool in the ballroom, ready for the witches to draw lots on the following day for their place in the contest. Perhaps Madame Olympia would dare to draw first, he suggested when he had gathered them together after the breakfast. So the enchantress dragged her aardvark by the rhinestone collar and came forward and put her hand into a hat. "Is this some sort of a joke?" she said disdainfully, putting the thing that she had just pulled out down onto the piano stool. It was an egg. There was only the shortest of pauses, and then it began. "That is an egg laid by my chicken," said Nancy Shouter. "Oh, no, it isn't. That is an egg laid by my chicken. I could tell that egg anywhere." The other witches came closer. There is always excitement when a familiar lays an egg. There could easily be a small dragon inside, or a dark stain which could be trained to grow out to be a fiend. Anything, and for once they could see what the Shudder twins were quarreling about. Mr. Ledbetter sighed. He did so want to get on with drawing lots. Ethel Feedbag now stepped forward. Working at the egg-packing station, she was reckoned to be an expert. "That egg," she pronounced, "be simply an egg." This, of course, set the shouters off again. "How dare you suggest that my chicken could lay an ordinary egg? Not your chicken, my chicken." Ethel shrugged. Nancy Shouter picked up the egg. Nora Shouter tried to pull it away from her. The next second, they were all peering down at the mess of yellow yolk, transparent white, and bits of shell sploshed across the carpet. Ethel was perfectly right. Whichever of the chickens had laid it, the thing was simply an egg. When they at last got round to drawing the lots, it worked out like this. Mabel Rack was number 1, which meant that she would be first to do her trick. Ethel Feedback was number 2, and the Shudder twins had drawn 3 and 4. Mother Bloodwort was number 5, and Madame Olympia was number 6, and the witch who would do her trick last on the actual night of Halloween and who had drawn number 7 was Belladonna. Fine Halloween that'll be, sneered Nancy Shouter. Blinking nightingales all over the place and angels singing the Hallelujah chorus. I shouldn't wonder. Once these words would have hurt Belladonna badly, but not now. Only half an hour earlier, with Rover and Terence, she had turned the ashtray in her bedroom into a hideous, grinning skull. There was only one more important thing for the witches to do, which was the most important of all. They had to decide on which piece of magic they were going to do and make lists of all the things that they needed for it, so that they could be got ready and waiting for them at the hall. All the other witches seemed to know. You could hear them plotting and whispering and hiding bits of paper from each other all over the hotel, but not Belladonna. Being black needs a lot of practice and a completely different way of thinking to being white, and when she tried to imagine a trick foul and vicious enough to please Ahriman, her mind just went completely blank. Oh, Terence, I wish I knew what to do, she said to the little boy who was sitting beside her on the bed. Even in the 2 days since he had left the home, Terence seemed to have changed. His mud-colored eyes had grown bright and eager, and his hair was no longer plastered to his head but bounced with life, and he wore his spectacles at quite a jaunty angle on the end of his nose. Happiness is almost as good as magic for altering a person's look. I suppose Mabel Rack will do some watery, fishy kind of trick, Belladonna went on, and Ethel Feebag is sure to do something countrious. And Madame Olympia... But the thought of Madame Olympia's trick was horrible in a special sort of way, and Belladonna left her sentence unfinished. She picked up the mirror. Ahriman was playing solitaire, not cheating exactly, but sometimes rearranging the cards a little. The look on his dark, brooding face, the white hairs in his curl, made her heart turn over. She was just going to put the mirror down again when a gray, wavering shape passed over its surface, and she saw Ahriman look up eagerly. Is that Sir Simon? Asked Terence. It was his first sight of the wicked spectre. Belladonna nodded. It's his special friend. Why is he banging his forehead like that? Terence wanted to know. It's guilt, because he killed all his wives. It makes a plashing noise, Lester says, but we can't hear it because the mirror is silent. Is that all he does? Asked Terence. Can't he speak or anything? Belladonna shook her head. You've got to remember he's been dead for 400 years. Whatever it is that people speak with must have gotten withered up by now. She sighed. It must be so lonely for Ahriman, having a friend who can't say anything. I mean, a plashing sound is not the same. Suddenly Terence gave a little cry, and Belladonna saw that behind his spectacles, his bright mud-colored eyes were positively sparkling with excitement. Belladonna, I've had a marvelous idea for your trick. Why don't you raise Sir Simon? Bring him back to life. Belladonna stared at him. Terence, I couldn't. Not possibly. That's the blackest magic in the whole world. Witches didn't just get burnt at the stake for that. They got hung and drawn and quartered and rolled up into little balls of dung. Terence didn't seem to think that this mattered. But you want to be black, don't you? What's the point of being just a little bit black? If you're going to win, surely you have to do the most awful thing that there is. Yes, but I never do it. Ahriman hasn't been able to do it, and Lester says that he's tried and tried and tried. Ahriman hasn't got Rover, said Terence. Belladonna was silent. The little boy's faith in the worm was somehow catching. Oh, Terence, do you really think that I could? Of course you could. And think how happy you'd be making Ahriman. That's what you want when you love someone, isn't it? To make them happy? So he had guessed her secret. Yes, said Belladonna quietly. That is what you want. She got up and went over to the wooden box that Terence had fitted out for Rover to live in when he wasn't in the matchbox in his pocket. Just to know that the worm was there, cradled deep in layers of damp, rich earth, made her feel at once more evil, more wicked, and more dark. What shall I put on my list, then? There are awful things that you need for necromancy. Warm sheep's blood, I think, and pits and things. Terence considered. I wouldn't bother with all that, he said. I think that stuff's just for people who haven't got Rover. I reckon you just gotta think black. So Belladonna got a sheet of hotel notepaper out of the bureau and wrote, which number 7, nothing. and went downstairs to give it to the secretary and the ogre. Mr. Ledbetter had just finished reading the list handed in by the other 6 witches, after which he had done something most unusual. He had sat down. Not even the pain in his stump, grating against the seat, could keep him on his feet. He had expected the witches to want a few things, like crucibles and thuribles, whatever they were, and a bit of wax for making images, perhaps a spot of moonwort or of mercury, that kind of thing. But no, the witches had really gone to town. 7 princesses, cried Mr. Ledbetter, holding up the list that the chambermaid had written out for witch number 5. What does she think I am? Lester pulled skillfully at the handle of the saber sticking from his mouth and drew it from his gullet. These'll have to go up to the hall, he said, coming to stand behind the secretary. We'll get the easy stuff, but the old man'll have to magic up the rest on the day. I'm not going into Turnbull and Buttles to ask for 7 princesses of the blood royal, nor are you. Mr. Ledbetter nodded. Much as he hated failing Ahriman, he could see that Lester was right. It was just then that Belladonna knocked, slipped in quietly, and handed in her list. Dear girl, said Mr. Ledbetter when he had read it. She's never any trouble. But secretly the ogre and the secretary were anxious and dismayed. Did it mean that Belladonna had gone white again? That she wasn't even going to try? What kind of magic could one do with nothing? Meanwhile, at Darkington Hall, the visiting judges had arrived. When the competition had first been suggested, Ahriman had thought of having a whole panel of judges, as they do for the Miss World contest or the Olympic Games. But people who really know about magic were getting hard to find, and anyway, now that he had seen some of the witches, Ahriman felt so gloomy that he just wanted to get everything over with in the simplest way possible. He had written to a lady called the Hag of the Dribble to ask if she would come and be a judge, but she hadn't answered, probably because there wasn't any writing paper in Dribble, and what he had left was an extremely old and rather frail ghoul called Henry Sniveller and a genie called Mr. Chatterjee. Mr. Chatterjee, like most genii, lived in a bottle out of which he swooshed if someone said the right words and remembered to unscrew the top. He was an Indian genie and felt the cold so dreadfully that mostly he liked to stay in the bottle and talk through the glass. As his accent was rather strong, this made it difficult to understand him, but he was a very fine judge of magic, having lived so long in the East where they do a lot of interesting things, like sending people up on flying carpets and then bringing them down so suddenly that their behinds become impaled on spikes. Mr. Sniveller was a different sort of person, a dark-faced, silent ghoul who lived behind a slaughterhouse in a satanic northern town and spent the night foraging in dustbins for unspeakable blood-red things, some of which he ate and some of which he collected. Ghouls are not particularly good at magic, but there is nothing darker, gloomier, or more evil than a ghoul, and Ahriman knew that he had been lucky to get him. So now the 3 of them sat at dinner around the carved oak table in the great hall, where the firelight flickered, the ravens croaked in the rafters, and, on the rug, the weary wizard-watcher rested its head. Ahriman was in low spirits. The witches were due to arrive in a couple of days, and kind Mr. Chatterjee, who was dining inside of his bottle because of the draughts, was doing his best to cheer him up. Oh my goodness, it will not be so bad, I think, to have a wife, he said in a soft voice, sucking up a piece of spaghetti which Ahriman had dropped in for him. Although tiny, he was most beautifully dressed in a white turban and a scarlet tunic frogged with gold. The ghoul did not seem to like that. Yuck, he said, and presently, when he had swallowed a fish finger, ugh. Ahriman was just beginning to explain about the contest and how it should be judged, when the usual plashing and moaning sound came, and Sir Simon appeared through the tapestry and thrust his pale and ghastly face at Ahriman. You see, said the wizard gloomily, he's trying to warn me. 7 times he's been married, and each time his wife drove him to murder. Quite simply drove him. Oh, dearie me, said Mr. Chatterjee, very much upset. How has he been murdering so much, please? Ahriman shrugged. The usual methods, I suppose. Drowning, stabbing, strangulation, that kind of thing. Then it is good he is only a ghost, said the little genie, or your new wife would perhaps be number 8. Ahriman threw him a sharp look from beneath his devilish eyebrows. It's only his own wives he kills. But for a while he stared abstractly into the fire, as though turning a new and important idea over in his mind. "Well now, gentlemen," he said at last, "to business. I thought with each witch should be given 10 points. 2 for darkness, 2 for power, 2 for presentation." There was a swoosh, and Mr. Chatterjee came out of his bottle, growing almost to normal size as he did. Like most genies, he was very serious about his work. And for the next hours, while the shadows lengthened and the wizard watcher slept, the judges of the Miss Witch of Todcaster contest bent over their task. Here's a picture. Chapter 8. The witches' camping wasn't as bad as Mr. Ledbetter thought it would be. It was worse. Not that there was anything wrong with the campsite. The campsite was very nice. Mr. Ledbetter had ordered a caravan from Mother Bloodwort, who had seemed to him too old to do well under canvas, and tents and a toilet block with showers and absolutely the latest kind of chemical loo. But the witches hadn't been in the West Meadow for 24 hours before pandemonium set in. For a start, Mother Bloodwort never got into her caravan at all. Madame Olympia had nabbed it straight away, no one knew how, and sat inside with the aardvark, despising the other witches and refusing to take her turn at any of the chores. Nancy and Nora Shudder spent the first night quarreling about which of them had the better camp bed, and ended by sticking penknives into each other's air mattresses. Ethel Feedbag's pig escaped from its pen and crashed into Mother Bloodwort's tent, sending the old witch flying just as she was trying to fix a mouse-blood poultice under her nightdress. And Mabel Rack insisted on using the cooking cauldron to give Doris a bubble bath, which made the breakfast porridge taste very strange indeed. It was Belladonna, of course, who was left to fetch the water and do the cooking, and the washing up, and however hard she tried to please everybody, braising cod eyes for Mabel Rack and roasting squashed hedgehogs on hot bricks for Ethel Feedbag, she got nothing but grumbles and sneers for her pains. And Belladonna had her own troubles. Mr. Ledbetter and the ogre were back in their rooms at the hall, and as Terence was supposed to be Mr. Ledbetter's nephew, he had been given a little room beside the secretaries in the servants' wing. This meant that Rover, too, was far away at the end of the long drive, sleeping in his wooden box under Terence's window. And with her familiar out of reach, Belladonna's old trouble was coming back, and coming back badly. The very first morning she had woken to find that her sleeping bag had come out in a rash of passion flowers, great pollen-loaded things that tickled abdominally and made her sneeze. And when she opened the flap of her tent, she found 6 twitch-eared, bright-eyed baby rabbits waiting for her, their paws in the air. "I'm not a white witch now, you know," she said crossly, but of course she let them in and conjured up a patch of lettuce for them out of her ground sheet. And it was clear to everybody that they were to stay. But if life was hard on the camping site in the West Meadow, it wasn't exactly easy in the hall. Mr. Sniveler, the ghoul, who was sleeping in the tapestry room, found it difficult to break the habit of years, and spent the night scooping fungus off the cellar walls, and filching raw mince from the refrigerator and taking it to bed. This meant he was usually very tired during the day, and fell asleep all over the place, waking up suddenly to say things like blood or slime, which made it difficult to carry on a sensible conversation. Poor Mr. Chatterjee had caught cold, and sat inside of his bottle, sneezing miserably so that the glass inside misted up, and he couldn't see out. As for Araman, well, as Lester said, anyone think he was going to have his bloomin' head chopped off instead of getting hitched the way he's carrying on. In all the bustle and fuss that led up to the start of the competition, Terence turned out to be worth his weight in gold. He ran errands, found the wizard's socks, removed the bits of bandage with scabs on them from Mr. Sniveler's bed, and stuffed Mr. Chatterjee's bottle with paper tissue so that the little genie could blow his swollen nose. And everything he did it happily and with delight, because Darkington, with its devilish maze and its stinking laboratory and ghastly zoo, seemed to him the most enchanting place in the whole world. But what Terence did whenever he could be spared was to study Sir Simon Montpelier, and quite soon he knew as much about the wicked wife-slayer as Araman himself. He learned that the spectre usually appeared first in the broom cupboard, where he limbered up with a couple of groans, a half-dozen eerie thumps, and a wail or two, before settling into the serious business of smiting his forehead with a plashing sound. Then, still plashing for all he was worth, the unhappy phantom would set off through the laundry room, up the stairs to the library, pass through a couple of bookcases and a stuffed bison, and end up in the great hall, popping out through a tapestry of a man being stuck full of arrows while being burnt at the stake, and ruining the appetite of whomever was at dinner. "You see," Terence said to Belladonna, who was stirring the witch's supper at the campfire, "he'll be absolutely terrific when he's raised. When you get close to him, his face is all sorts of loathsome and ruined looking, and when he bursts the wall alive, it will be a sensation." "Oh, Terence, I do hope so," said Belladonna. The baby rabbits hadn't gone, nor had the passion flowers, and the tree behind her tent was bearing golden pears. "Tell me," she went on, "how is he? Is he still so sad?" She meant Araman, of course. The great magician was seldom from her mind. "Well, he is a little bit, but you've got to remember that he's never seen you, and he doesn't know that you're going to win." "No," said Belladonna, "he certainly doesn't know that." But she already felt blacker and more hopeful. It was always like that when Terence came. And so at last, after all the preparations and the fuss, the first day of the contest dawned. Mabel Rack, witch number 1, had gotten up early and stood for 2 hours into the shower, so that her legs did not dry out on her big day. She had dressed with care, fastening the sea slug brooch beneath her gown, but she was not nervous. Owing to Mrs. Rack having been a mermaid, Mabel was 1/4 fish, and, as it is well known, fishes are cold-blooded and never get excited. As everyone had expected, Mabel had decided to do her trick beside the sea. The place that she had chosen was called the Devil's Cauldron, a sandy bay flanked by the brooding granite cliffs and strewn with jagged rocks to which dark seaweed slimily clung. Backing the sand was a strip of turf, and it was here, at the trestle table which Lester had dragged out for them, that the judges sat. Araman the Awful, wearing his robe with the constellations on it, was in the middle. Mr. Chatterjee, inside of his bottle, on account of the nippy breeze, was on the magician's left, and on the right, pale and exhausted after a night of hideous wandering, dropped Mr. Sniveler. The other witches, gowned and masked, so that Araman couldn't catch even an accidental glimpse of them, were huddled behind a clump of gourd bushes, all except for Madame Olympia, who had stayed snootily inside her caravan. Araman now got up to make a speech. He declared the Miss Witch of Todcaster contest open, and welcomed any witch practicing black magic on another witch, and welcomed all the competitors. He reminded them of the rules. Any witch practicing black magic on another witch, or her familiars, would be disqualified. The competitors must not show their faces, and the judges' decisions were final. Then he sat down, and Mr. Ledbetter, shouting through a megaphone like a film director, said, "Witch number 1, step forward!" There was clapping from the other witches, and from some of the villagers who had come up the cliff path, and Mabel had emerged from behind the gorse bushes. Only the lower part of her face showed beneath the mask, but it was enough to make Araman hope frantically that she was going to go to the sea and drown. "Present your list," ordered Mr. Ledbetter, and Mabel went up to the judge's table with her piece of paper. In the neat hand of a practiced shopkeeper, Mabel had written, 1 gong, loud, some golden rings, a drowned sailor. "The manager of the hotel was kind enough to lend us his gong," said Mr. Ledbetter, "and we got the golden rings from Woolsworth. But there is this matter of the drowned sailor." Said Araman, looking rather sick. "There is a place called Davy Jones's Locker under the sea, where the bodies of drowned sailors are supposed to be kept, but he had never fancied it. Messy, it sounded, as though things would have been nibbled at, and of course, of all things, Araman hated a mess." Then he got an idea and smiled. "Hand me my wand, Ledbetter," he said, and shut his eyes. The next second, a large gray skeleton, stuck together with bits of wire, swirled through the air and landed at the sea witch's feet. "I wanted a fresh one," complained Miss Rack. "One with some meat on him. It's for bait." "If witch number 1 is not satisfied," snapped Araman, fire shooting from his nostrils, "she may withdraw from the contest." "Oh, all right," said Mabel sulkily, "but he's a very funny shape." This was certainly true. The skeleton had, in fact, belonged to the biology lab of a large comprehensive school in the Midlands, and the poor gentleman hadn't exactly been a sailor, but an undertaker who had liked messing about in boats, and had fallen, in the year 1892, into the Shropshire Union Canal. Owing to the carelessness of the children and the fact that the biology master was the kind who couldn't keep order, the skeleton had gotten badly jumbled. The skull was back to front, 3 finger bones were missing, and for some reason he seemed to have 3 thighs. "Announce the trick that you will perform," Mr. Ledbetter shouted through his megaphone. Mabel Rack turned to face the judges. She had taken Doris out of her bucket and thrown the familiar's tentacles carelessly around her shoulders, like a mink stole, while she held the animal's round body under her arm, squeezing it for power and darkness like someone playing the bagpipes. Then she spoke. "I shall call forth the Kraken from the deep," she said. There was a stunned silence. The Kraken, that dread and dangerous monster, has lain since the dawn of time beneath the surface of the sea, dragging ships to their doom, creating by its lightest movement tidal waves that could drown cities. "Oh, Terence," whispered Belladonna, "I'm scared, aren't you? Fancy Mabel Rack being able to do that." And indeed all the onlookers were a little bit ashamed. They had never taken the fishy witch too seriously, and now even Ahriman the Awful was impressed. "Instruct witch number 1 to proceed," he said. Mabel Rack stepped forward to the edge of the ocean. The sea witch was no slouch, and she had prepared her act with care. She would begin by peppering the sea with golden rings to fetch up the underwater spirits, who were known to be extremely fond of jewelry, who would then come and help her when she called them to her aid. As for the drowned sailor, he was meant to lure the Kraken from his lair, and so make it easier for the spirits to find him. She put Doris back into her bucket and threw the rings one by one into the foam. Then she raised her arms, and the skeleton of the undertaker, who had liked messing about in boats, rose up slowly in the air, turned a somersault, and tumbled into the wave. "Levitation," said Ahriman. "Quite neat. Give her a mark for that, don't you think?" The thought of seeing a Kraken had quite cheered him up. Next, Mabel picked up the gong and thumped it with a resounding wallop, which sent the seabirds flying up in terror. Then, "Mighty spirits of the deep, pray you waken from your sleep. Come as fast as you are able. Come and help your sister Mabel," chanted Miss Rack. She decided to go for poetry for the contest. This may have been a mistake. Some witches have a feeling for poetry and some haven't. Miss Rack hadn't. From thunderous reef and mighty grot, the dreaded Kraken must be got." "What's a grot?" whispered Mother Bloodwort pettishly from behind the gorse bushes. "It's short for grotto, I think," Belladonna whispered back. "Sort of a cave." Though she knew that she had no chance of winning now, who could do anything more terrible than calling up a Kraken, she was just looking at Miss Rack with shining eyes. There wasn't a mean streak anywhere in Belladonna. The pause that followed was an anxious one. Even Ahriman wondered if he'd been hasty. Would it be flooding? Whirlpools? Cannibalism? There are too many stories of witches summoning up evil forces which they themselves cannot control. The pause lengthened. The ghoul, unable to take the strain, dropped off to sleep, and still the wind sawed and the gray sea foamed and boiled against the rocks. But now there was a change. The white crest of the water died away to leave a creeping, wrinkled skin of water. The sky seemed to darken. The wind dropped. The seabirds fell silent. What came next was a strange heaping up of the water into a mound that grew and grew and became a huge tower topped with foam. And now the tower reared upward, bent and turned into a race, a great tunnel of boiling, churning water, heading straight for the shore. The witches huddled together. Terence's hand crept into Belladonna's, and at the judge's table, Ahriman reached for the genie's bottle and screwed the top on. Just in time, a towering wave landed with a thunderous crash upon the sand, and when the foam and turmoil died down, the onlookers blinked. Miss Rack had called on the spirits of the deep to help her find a Kraken, and it was perhaps natural that these should be mermaids. But the 4 ladies who now sat on the beach were fleshy and no longer young, and they seemed to be rather pointlessly clutching a large black handbag, each of them holding on to it with a pudgy arm. The rings which Miss Rack had sent to them glistened on their fingers, and their lower halves were sensibly covered in tail cozies of knitted bladder-wrack. But all of them were topless, and Airman had already flinched and closed his eyes. Miss Rack stepped closer, and her mouth opened in horror. "Septic suckerfish," she swore under her breath. And indeed, it was the most appalling luck. Of all the mermaids in the ocean, she had managed to call up her mother's 4 unmarried sisters, Aunt Edna, Aunt Gwendolyn, Aunt Phoebe, and Aunt Jane. For a moment, Mabel panicked. There is probably nothing less black or magical in the whole world than a person's aunt. Then she remembered that with the top half of her face covered, she might not be recognized. There had been a bit of a split in the family when her mother had opted for legs. So, disguising her voice as well as she could, she began, "Summoned here, I bid thee hearken. You have been to fetch the Kraken. Search the corners of the ocean." She broke off, trying to find a rhyme for ocean, and also wondering a bit whether the ocean really had corners. But she needn't have bothered, because all 4 of her aunts were talking at once, taking no notice of each other or her. "Oh, my dear, we're so glad you called. We've been worried sick." Not knowing what to do for the beast, you see, when the oil rig went right through its mother's head. Skull shattered, not a hope. Poor soul. "It's meant," I said to Edna, "didn't I, dear?" "You did, Phoebe. It's meant," you said. "Somebody knows what's just right." The aunt who had just spoken broke off and edged closer, peering at Mabel Rack. "Funny, I swear I'd seen you before. Those nostrils, that mouth." Still clutching their handbag, the mermaids waddled towards her on their tails. "It can't be, of course. But isn't she the spit of poor Agatha?" "The spit," echoed Aunt Jane. Mabel Rack retreated backwards, but it was too late. "It must be Agatha's little girl, the one she had with the fishmonger after the operation. It is her, I'm sure. Mabel, wasn't she called? Mabel, dear little Mabel." Terribly excited, the aunts dropped their handbag at last and surrounded their niece with great flopping of tails and waving of pink, plump arms. "Stop it," hissed Mabel furiously. "This is a competition. Keep away, and speak in verse. You're disgracing me." There was a moment of outraged silence while Mabel continued to glare angrily at her relations. It was a silly thing for her to do. Mermaids are famous for being touchy, and so, of course, are aunts. "Oh, very well," said Aunt Edna haughtily. "We know when we're not wanted, don't we? It was you who called us, you know. Such airs, just because her father had legs and a shop." As they spoke, the mermaids began to waddle huffily away, speaking over their shoulders as they went. "We were going to stay and give you a few hints, but we won't bother now. Don't blame us if you don't know how much sieve squirt to give it. Speak in verse indeed." And with a last offended sniff, the 4 mermaids dived back into the water and were gone. "Stop!" shouted the desperate Miss Rack. "Come back! You've left your handbag." It was a dreadful moment. The mermaids had gone, the mighty Kraken still slumbered beneath the deep, and on the face of Armin the Awful there was a look that froze the marrow in one's bones. And now this handbag. Only, was it a handbag? For even as they watched, the object on the sand seemed to give kind of a shudder. Next it puffed itself up into a round, smooth dome like the top of a tadpole or of a small and very squidgy flying saucer. In the middle of this dome, 2 slits now appeared, and a pair of shining, tear-filled, sky-blue eyes stared upward at Ms. Rack. "Oh my God," said Lester, with whom the penny had already dropped. The thing now went into the kind of private struggle, and from its round, dark blancmange of a body, there appeared one by one 8 wavery, wobbly legs, each ending in a blob-shaped foot. Peering closer, the onlookers could see, at the rim of the saucer, a round hole whose reddened edges the little finger bone of the undertaker sadly hung. Aunt Jane had given it to him to help him with his teething. Even with the evidence there before them, no one could quite believe it. They watched in silence as the handbag raised itself once more, tottered a few pathetic steps, and fell in a despairing, quivering heap before Miss Rack. "Mommy," it said in its piteous voice. "Mommy." The sea witch stepped back in disgust. Terence clung to Belladonna to stop her running forward, and the ghoul woke suddenly and said, "Spittle!" and Ahriman the Awful rose from his seat. "What in the name of devilry and darkness is that thing?" He knew, of course. You could say a lot about Ahriman, but not that he was thick. "That, sir," said the ogre, "is a kraken. A baby kraken. A very young baby and dead." Indeed. Hearing voices, feeling himself unwanted by the very witch who had called him from the sea, the kraken, his eyes, his whole body streaming with tears, now began to totter wetly to the table where the judges sat. 3 times he fell, his legs hopelessly knotted, and 3 times he rose again, leaving each time a glistening pool of water until he reached the chair of Ahriman the Awful, Wizard of the North. "Daddy," said the kraken, rolling his anguished eyes upward, and then again, "Daddy." Ahriman looked down and shuddered. "Take it away, Lester. Remove it. Throw it back in the sea." The ogre did not move. "You heard me, Lester. It is dribbling on my feet." "Sir," said the ogre, "that kraken is an orphan. Its mother had an oil rig through her head. It'll be 2,000 years before that kraken is old enough to swallow as much as a canoe. If you throw it back now, it'll die." "So?" said Ahriman nastily. Over by the gorse bushes, Belladonna closed her eyes and prayed. Mr. Chatterjee tried to swish out of his bottle, hit his head on the screw top, and fell back, his turban over his dark, kind face. "Daddy," said the kraken, his voice only a whisper now, and raised from the top of his body a tiny, trembling, hopeless-looking tail. "Oh, well, plague on the lot of you," cursed Ahriman, and scooping up the kraken, which immediately began to squeak and giggle because it was extremely ticklish, the furious magician left the judge's table and strode away towards the hall. That's the end of chapter 8. We will pick up with chapter 9 in our next video, which will be the turn of the second witch, Ethel Feedback. This has been Witch Witch by Eva Ibbotson, published by Scholastic. I'm Sarah Mari. I'm from Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I'm thanking you for listening to the story. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you keep coming back to listen to more. Bye!